Before the shells, before the trenches, before the world tore itself apart, there was silence. Not peace, but a breath being held by an entire continent. Europe in 1913 stood like a grand theatre before the curtain rose. The cities glowed. Paris glittered with electric light. Berlin hummed with industry. London reigned as the empire's heart. No one imagined that, beneath this modern confidence, the machinery of destruction was already in motion. But in the quiet corners, in the coal mines of France, in the listening rooms of the War Office, in the back alleys of Brussels, people were already preparing for a kind of war no one yet understood. This is the story of those who fought beneath the surface, the unseen soldiers, the spies, the miners, the artists, and the healers, whose war was not written in history books. The story of whispers beneath the guns. In northern France, under the city of Arras, lay a labyrinth. Miles of chalk and limestone tunnels carved centuries before by medieval quarrymen. When British engineers arrived in 1916, they found an opportunity. Here, they could wage a new kind of battle, a war underground. They brought in miners from Wales, New Zealand, and Canada, men who once dug coal and now dug toward enemy lines. For months, these men lived in total darkness, carving tunnels beneath the German front. They whispered, moved barefoot, and worked by candlelight, for one misplaced sound could mean discovery and death. The Germans were doing the same. Sometimes the two groups of miners would hear each other, faint tapping through the soil. When that happened, all tools stopped. They would listen, guess the distance, then plant explosives. One side would live, the other would vanish in an instant of underground thunder. In April 1917, the tunnels under Arras became something more, a hidden city. Engineers expanded the quarries into an underground fortress. 25,000 soldiers could shelter below, with electric lights, hospitals, and telephone lines. They called it the underground world. On April 9th, when the Battle of Arras began, soldiers erupted from beneath the earth like ghosts, storming German lines in minutes. Few knew it then, but the tunnelers of Arras and Messines changed warfare forever. They proved that silence could be as deadly as artillery. While miners dug below, above ground, another invisible army was at work. In Belgium, after the German occupation, a network of spies, many of them women, formed an organization called La Dame Blanche, the White Lady. Its members used coded knitting patterns, church bells, and musical notes to report troop movements to the Allies. They weren't soldiers. They were teachers, housewives, nuns, even teenagers, passing maps and messages hidden in loaves of bread or under children's dolls. They risked everything. Captured spies faced torture or execution. Yet hundreds continued their quiet resistance until the end of the war. By 1918, La Dame Blanche had more than 1,200 agents, many never officially recognized. Their work was so effective that German generals later admitted they could not fully move troops through Belgium without being detected. The war, it turned out, wasn't just fought with guns, but with secrets. As Europe's armies clashed, another kind of battle was unfolding, the War of Messages. Telegraph lines hummed with encrypted codes. Entire departments of linguists and mathematicians were tasked with breaking enemy ciphers. But one of the strangest methods of communication came not from soldiers, but from musicians. In 1916, Allied intelligence discovered that German agents in neutral countries were sending messages through sheet music. Each note, rhythm, and rest carried a coded instruction. A melody could direct a submarine attack or signal the movement of trains. To fight back, British intelligence began using the same trick, embedding coordinates into waltzes, patriotic marches, and even church hymns distributed across Europe. In cafes from Amsterdam to Geneva, pianists unknowingly played the sound of war. Beneath the flags of the great empires marched millions who never chose to fight. From Senegal and Algeria, from India and Nepal, from Canada and Australia, men crossed oceans to fight in a war they did not start. Among them were the tirailleurs Senegalais, African infantrymen who served in the French army. They endured freezing winters, discrimination, and brutal frontline combat. Their letters home spoke of confusion. "How can we fight for liberty," one soldier wrote, "when we ourselves are not free?" Their bravery, however, was unquestionable. At Verdun, at the Marne, and on the Somme, colonial troops stood their ground when others fell back. Yet, after the war, many were erased from the victory parades, their sacrifices left unspoken for generations. In 1915, British hospitals began seeing a strange condition. Soldiers who had survived explosions now shook uncontrollably. Some went blind without injury. Others could not speak or screamed at night from unseen terrors. At first, doctors called them cowards. Later, they called it shell shock. It was not until the war's end that doctors like W.H.R. Rivers and Sigmund Freud's contemporaries realized this was trauma, the invisible wound. In the trenches, they experimented with talking therapy, music, and even hypnosis. The modern field of psychiatry was born not in peace but in the aftermath of horror. In 1918, as the war neared its end, a new enemy appeared, unseen and unstoppable: the Spanish flu. It did not begin in Spain, but in Kansas, at Camp Funston, where American soldiers trained before sailing for France. Because of wartime censorship, reports of the flu were suppressed in the US, Britain, France, and Germany. Only neutral Spain allowed open reporting, giving rise to the misleading name. The disease spread with troop ships. By the end of 1919, more people had died from influenza than from 4 years of war. It was the last, silent battlefield of the Great War. When the guns finally stopped on November 11, 1918, the world exhaled. But in the tunnels of Arras, the rooms of La Dame Blanche, and the minds of broken soldiers, the echoes continued. Millions returned home changed, by things no monument could express. The underground cities collapsed, the spies faded into anonymity, and the maps of empires were redrawn. But the whispers, the songs, the codes, the trauma, all remained, waiting for someone to listen again. And now, a century later, we do. The war had become an organism of its own, vast, hungry, and unrelenting. It devoured men and metal, cities and soil. Every day, 1,000 letters left the front lines, and 1,000 never arrived. The generals fought above ground, but below the surface, another war unfolded. A war of ideas, inventions, betrayals, and illusions. In London, inside a discreet building on room 40 of the Admiralty, a group of cryptographers labored day and night. They were not soldiers, but professors, chess players, and linguists. Drawn from universities and retired telegraph clerks. Their mission: to decode German naval communications. They worked by candlelight and intuition, feeding scraps of intercepted messages into primitive decoding wheels. Every letter mattered. Every comma could shift the meaning of a fleet movement. Then, in early 1917, they uncovered something that would change the war. It was the Zimmermann telegram, a secret German proposal to Mexico, offering U.S. territory if it joined the Central Powers. The codebreakers cracked it. When the message was revealed, it enraged the American public and pushed the United States closer to joining the war. A war once confined to Europe was about to go global. But even as the armies raged, a few men and women sought peace in silence. In 1917, neutral Switzerland became the heart of covert diplomacy. In the cafes of Geneva, spies, idealists, and exiled revolutionaries met over coffee and coded notes. Among them was a quiet German industrialist, Karl Mühlstein, who secretly passed messages between Berlin and Paris, hoping to negotiate a ceasefire through intermediaries. In Stockholm, two women, Rosika Schwimmer of Hungary and Jane Addams of America, formed the International Congress of Women. They believed dialogue could end the slaughter. They were mocked as dreamers. But their efforts planted the first seeds of what would later become the League of Nations. Their quiet resistance was not recorded on any battlefield, but in letters that crossed borders at great risk. In the spring of 1917, after the disaster of the Nivelle offensive, something unthinkable happened. Entire French divisions, exhausted, disillusioned, and broken, refused to return to the front. They didn't march against their officers. They simply stopped. In some trenches, soldiers raised signs that read, "We will defend France, but we will not attack." The French government censored all reports. General Philippe Pétain restored order quietly, executing only a few leaders, promising rest for the rest. But in truth, he knew. The French army had fought to its limit. The mutinies were not rebellion. They were exhaustion turned human. Across the front, even in Germany, morale fractured. Letters home became darker. A German corporal named Adolf Hitler wrote from the Bavarian regiment that the war had revealed a world built on lies. Few paid attention. While men killed each other with steel and fire, science, too, was at war. In laboratories from Berlin to Cambridge, chemists invented weapons the world had never known. Mustard gas, phosgene, chlorine. Invisible killers drifting across fields once filled with wheat. But there were others who used science to save rather than destroy. In France, a young microbiologist named Albert Calmette worked to create antidotes to chemical burns. In Britain, nurse Edith Cavell, before her execution by the Germans in 1915, had smuggled hundreds of soldiers to safety while running a secret medical network. Meanwhile, in secret hospitals, the earliest prosthetics were being designed. Mechanical arms, steel jaws, glass eyes. Doctors who once amputated now rebuilt. Modern reconstructive surgery was born from the ruins of the human body. Not all weapons fired bullets. Some drew lines. Throughout the war, artists were sent to the front. Officially as documentarians, unofficially as witnesses. They painted what photographs could not. The terror, the beauty, the absurd stillness between shell bursts. British war artist Paul Nash once wrote, "I am no longer an artist interested in landscapes. I am a messenger who will bring back the truth of war." His paintings, twisted trees, shattered helmets, endless mud, became the silent testimony of a generation. In Germany, Otto Dix did the same. His sketches, hidden until after the war, showed soldiers half buried, their faces frozen in mud. No heroism, only survival. The war changed art as much as it changed humanity. Realism gave way to abstraction, as if language itself could no longer hold what men had seen. While men fought, women carried nations on their shoulders. They filled factories, drove ambulances, served as nurses, and kept entire economies alive. In Britain, the munitionettes, women who worked with TNT, were nicknamed Canary Girls because the chemicals turned their skin yellow. Many fell ill, but they kept producing shells that fueled the war effort. In Russia, women went even further. In 1917, the Women's Battalion of Death marched into battle to inspire demoralized male troops. Led by Maria Boshkareva, they charged through enemy fire. Their courage was extraordinary and tragic. Few returned. When the war ended, millions of women had proven their strength, but found themselves asked to step aside again. The fight for equality would not end with the armistice. Even in chaos, music survived. Soldiers carried violins, harmonicas, even gramophones into the trenches. Songs became shields against despair. In France, Quan Madelon played from every café. In Britain, they sang It's a Long Way to Tipperary. Even the Germans had their own version, humming Lili Marleen under their breath. In the rare, quiet moments between shelling, soldiers from both sides sometimes sang across no man's land, voices echoing through fog and wire. It was a reminder that the enemy was human. By 1918, as the war reached its crescendo, technology transformed intelligence again. Wireless telegraphy allowed armies to send messages across miles, but it also opened them to interception. The British developed mobile listening trucks that moved with the front, triangulating German signals. In response, German operators used fake transmissions to lure artillery fire away from real positions. The front had become a vast chessboard of deception: radios, dummy lines, false codes. It was the birth of electronic warfare. One of the first electronic spies was an engineer named Reginald Fessenden, the same man who had invented radio voice transmission in 1900. Now, his inventions were used to save lives and end them. By mid-1918, the German High Command knew the end was near. Famine gripped the homeland. America's fresh divisions, 1 million men strong, had arrived in France. At the same time, German troops mutinied in Kiel, demanding peace. Revolution erupted. The Kaiser abdicated. And in a railway car in Compiègne Forest, the armistice was signed. The guns that had thundered for 4 years went silent. But below the earth, in the tunnels, the silence was deafening. Miners who had lived underground walked into daylight, blinking, aged beyond their years. They had survived what the world called the war to end all wars. Few knew how wrong that phrase would be. The Great War ended not with victory, but with exhaustion. Empires fell, maps redrew, and the 20th century began in the rubble. But the secrets, the codebreakers, the spies, the artists, the doctors, and the invisible soldiers shaped everything that came after. They were the architects of a new kind of warfare and a new kind of peace. Their stories, long hidden, remain the quiet heartbeat beneath the thunder of history. When the guns fell silent on November 11th, 1918, Europe did not celebrate, it exhaled. For 4 years, the world had lived inside a storm. Now came the uneasy calm. A silence so vast it seemed to echo across the continents. But beneath that silence, things moved. The war might have ended, but its shadows lingered, in memory, in politics, in the hidden files of nations. This is the story of what the world could not see. The afterwar, the secret legacy of World War I. The armistice brought millions home, but millions more never returned. Many had no graves, lost to artillery, to mud, to time. So the Allies created something new, the tomb of the unknown soldier. In 1920, remains from unidentified soldiers were selected from battlefields across Europe. No one knew who they were, British, French, or German, only that they represented them all. When the coffin passed through Paris, thousands lined the streets in silence. At the Arc de Triomphe, a flame was lit, a fire that still burns today. It was more than remembrance. It was a recognition of anonymity, the shared fate of those who fought in secret and in plain sight alike. But far from the cities, other graves were forgotten. African and Indian regiments buried in unmarked fields, prisoners of war who died building roads in Siberia, laborers from China known as the Chinese Labor Corps who dug trenches and cleared mines long after the war ended and vanished from the records. Their names, erased, are only now being rediscovered. During the war, governments had learned the power of words and lies. Propaganda had moved nations, rallied armies, and justified unthinkable acts. In Britain, the War Propaganda Bureau, secretly based at Wellington House, had recruited famous writers, Arthur Conan Doyle, Rudyard Kipling, and H.G. Wells, to write essays and pamphlets supporting the war effort. In Germany, news agencies became extensions of the military. In France, posters promised victory through sacrifice. And, in America, George Creel's Committee on Public Information turned patriotism into an industry. By 1919, these propaganda networks did not disappear. They evolved into advertising agencies, political consultancies, and later, intelligence offices. The Great War had taught the modern world a dangerous truth. If you could control information, you could control reality itself. When diplomats gathered at Versailles in 1919, the public saw only the grand images, chandeliers, maps, pens signing peace. But behind closed doors, another battle was being fought. A war of words, debts, and secrets. Among the delegates were silent men with briefcases, economists, cartographers, and military attachés carrying documents marked classified. The Allies had compiled detailed intelligence on Germany's economy, colonies, and shipping routes. These documents were not destroyed after the treaty. They became the foundation of post-war surveillance networks. From those archives emerged a new science, geopolitics. The idea that maps could predict and control power. A century later, those same principles still shape international strategy. The war's end did not bring peace for everyone. In Eastern Europe, chaos followed. New nations were born: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, from the wreckage of empires. But millions of demobilized soldiers found themselves stateless. One of them, a Czech named Tomáš Masaryk, used his exile in London to campaign for independence. Another, a young corporal named Benito Mussolini, turned his war experience into political rage. In the defeated Germany, veterans organizations, Freikorps, armed themselves and fought street battles. They were men who could not stop fighting. And among them was a failed artist who would one day plunge the world into another war. The Great War had ended, but the war within men had not. Governments, afraid of unrest, began censoring soldiers' memoirs and letters. Entire paragraphs describing mutiny, desertion, or despair were deleted. Photographs of mass graves were hidden. For decades, even the underground war, the tunnelers, the spies, the coders, remained classified. When veterans spoke of nightmares, they were dismissed as weak. Doctors labeled it neurasthenia. Only in the 1920s did the term post-traumatic stress begin to emerge. The ghosts of the trenches had followed their soldiers home, invisible but unyielding. In small villages across Europe, men awoke screaming from dreams of mud and thunder. They called it the aftersound. Across Europe, secret hospitals treated the broken minds of soldiers. In London's Seal Hain Military Hospital, music was prescribed as therapy. Shell-shocked patients were taught to paint, sing, or write, long before art therapy became a recognized field. In Vienna, a young neurologist named Sigmund Freud expanded his theories on trauma, inspired by the war's psychological wreckage. His student, Wilhelm Reich, later argued that entire societies could experience collective neurosis after mass violence. It was a theory the world would soon have reason to believe. After the armistice, the official war artists, Paul Nash, Christopher Nevinson, Otto Dix, and Kethe Kollwitz, faced their greatest challenge: to make peace visible. Kollwitz, whose son Peter had died in 1914, sculpted the grieving parents, two figures kneeling over an invisible grave. It became a universal symbol of loss. Paul Nash painted "We Are Making a New World," a landscape of shattered trees and scarred land under a red dawn. He wrote, "I saw the monstrous anger of the guns, and now I paint the silent anger of the earth." Their work became the moral memory of the war, truth through art when words failed. In the 1920s, military scientists in Britain and France began quietly studying collective memory. They observed how veterans described the same battle differently, depending on rank, nationality, or trauma. This became the foundation for what would later be known as psychological operations, understanding how memory itself could be shaped. Propaganda, psychiatry, and education merged into a new form of influence, one that would define the modern world. The Great War had not only redrawn borders, it had redrawn minds. In forgotten warehouses, prototypes of wartime inventions gathered dust: remote-controlled torpedoes, sound-ranging devices, and primitive drones. Few realized that World War I had already invented the blueprints of modern warfare: wireless control, radar experiments, flamethrowers, armored vehicles. When the next war came, these inventions would resurface, perfected, but in the 1920s they were silent relics of a war the world tried to forget. While nations rebuilt, a few women remained in the shadows, veterans of espionage now living under false names. Among them was Louise de Bettigny, the queen of spies, whose network La Dame Blanche had saved thousands. She died in captivity in 1918, her story censored for decades. In 1928, British intelligence finally declassified her files. Historians were stunned to find that her operations had been the basis for MI6's early methods. Even today, her strategies, invisible ink, coded knitting, false identities, remain foundational to intelligence work. Far from Europe, in the colonies of Asia and Africa, returning veterans brought with them new ideas: freedom, equality, nationalism. Indian soldiers who had fought for Britain questioned why they were denied the very democracy they had defended. In Egypt, Saad Zaghloul led protests for independence. In Vietnam, a young man named Nguyen Tat Thanh, later known as Ho Chi Minh, was working as a kitchen assistant at the Paris Peace Conference, learning the language of revolution. The seeds of the 20th century's liberation movements were sown in the trenches of World War I. As nations celebrated peace, the Spanish flu, that invisible Second War, was still raging. Governments downplayed it to protect morale. Doctors were forbidden to publish reports that contradicted official statistics. Historians now estimate it killed between 50 and 100 million people. It was the final silence of the war, a silence enforced by fear. In the 1920s, veterans associations began building memorials, but they were not monuments of victory. They were monuments of warning. Inscribed on the Menin Gate in Ypres, every evening, to this day, a bugler plays the last post. In Britain, on November 11th, people stopped for 2 minutes of silence, the first act of collective mourning in human history. From that tradition, every Armistice Day and Veterans Day was born. When the 1930s came and the world began to slide once more toward conflict, old veterans recognized the signs. Propaganda returned. Hatred returned. Marching songs echoed familiar rhythms. In 1936, as fascism rose in Europe, one British veteran wrote in a letter, "I have seen this before. The language, the flags, the shouting. The war is not over. It only sleeps." He was right. More than a century later, the Great War still speaks, not in parades or speeches, but in quiet reminders, in museums, in diaries, in fading letters found in attic boxes. In the tunnels of Arras, where miners once whispered prayers before lighting their fuses. In the notebooks of code breakers. In the hearts of families who still trace a name on a stone. World War I was not just a war of nations. It was a war of voices, silenced, hidden, or forgotten. But every voice mattered. They were the artists, the miners, the nurses, the spies, the dreamers. They fought not for glory, but because history demanded it. And though the cannons have long ceased, their whispers remain. Beneath the guns, beneath the earth, beneath the noise of time. If the Great War taught humanity anything, it is this: that truth survives in the quiet, in the stories left behind by those who lived unseen. The war's greatest lesson was not in its battles, but in its silence. And perhaps that silence, the whisper beneath the guns, was the sound of the world learning, for the first time, what it truly meant to be human.